Hello, and welcome to Underscored, a podcast by Young Voices. I'm your host, Stephen Kent, and we've got a lot to cover today in what has been a tumultuous week in politics, no doubt. Here with me to help break it down and make sense of it all is Alex Muresianu of Young Voices and Natalie Dowzicky, Young Voices and Libertarianism.org. First, we're going to dive into the Democrats' impeachment conundrum.
It's political suicide to go into an impeachment inquiry without bipartisan support.
Then 2020 and the politics of trade war with China.
Give people economic freedom and increase sort of prosperity and growth. People will start demanding political freedoms as well. This has played out in a lot of places, but it really hasn't in China.
And lastly, Hollywood secedes from Georgia and maybe most of the South after a wave of abortion laws.
I think that would be the main concern, but I think generally film tax credit programs are bad.
As the great and noble newsman Chris Cuomo would say, let's get after it. So in Washington, any remaining appetite for stability and governance has pretty much dried up. This week featured renewed pushes within Nancy Pelosi's caucus to impeach President Trump. Infrastructure Week was always sort of a pipe dream, but now it's even more unlikely to ever get going. So Democrats are caught between their memory of what went wrong for Republicans when they impeached Bill Clinton and the sincere belief that Donald Trump is legitimately impeachable. Alex, I want to start with you. Do you see Democrats pushing Nancy Pelosi into action on impeachment, or will she keep her heels dug in? It seems to me like an unsustainable position by the speaker to avoid this demand much longer.
Yeah, I think that seems to be the direction things are going right now. Initially, earlier in the year, it seemed like Pelosi had a pretty good handle on her caucus and the Democratic members of the House. I thought she seemed to be sort of in control of them, but I think the more left wing or more adamant members of the Democratic House seem to be sort of pushing her, and I don't think she can hold them off much longer. But we'll see. I think Nancy Pelosi is a very sort of wily political operator, and we'll see what happens. But so I would say never count Pelosi out.
And I think as of recently, like even the only like 45% of the public supported impeachment processes or even like inquiries. And I think without more support, Pelosi's going to, like, as you said, Stephen, continue to dig her heels into the ground until there's a breaking point, which I'm not even sure what that breaking point would be. And I mean, as we saw with Infrastructure Week, Trump stormed out of a meeting and said he was unwilling to work with the Dems until they stopped investigating him. But like, if we're going to storm out of every meeting now just because we're on the heels of an impeachment inquiry, I think we're going to continue to get nothing done.
Well, Natalie, you mentioned sort of the need for bipartisan consensus to pursue like a healthy impeachment that actually works politically. Are you sort of referring there to Newt Gingrich and his experience going after Bill Clinton? Because my understanding of that was it was also sort of a one-sided bipartisan endeavor, which sort of doomed his caucus.
Right, exactly. So I think, like you said earlier, the Democrats are very worried about it being a similar scenario in terms of it's political suicide, right? I mean, in my opinion, you would be acting principled and holding people accountable, but that's a different story. But it's political suicide to go into an impeachment inquiry without bipartisan support. That is Pelosi's point of view now.
Yeah, and I guess I would add on the sort of bipartisan front, like back then, if I recall correctly, under Clinton, both the House and the Senate were controlled by Republicans.
Yeah.
And now, I mean, I can't imagine that, however many, I think you would need, like 19 or so Republicans in the Senate to flip and vote to impeach the president for an impeachment to actually go through, which means that this would be, kind of a voting for impeachment in the House would be very symbolic. And wouldn't actually achieve the end that they want, which might be fine. Like sometimes it's good to do what you think is the right thing, even if it's not going to sort of materialize. But I think that would be a relevant consideration sort of electorally for the Democrats.
So why Justin Amash? I think that this might be their only ability to say that they've engaged in some sort of bipartisan exercise, and it's been sort of getting parroted on cable news as well that now there is a bipartisan level of support for impeaching the president because Justin Amash, a libertarian-oriented Republican from Michigan, has signaled his support for this. Unless you are a YAL chapter, a Young Americans for Liberty chapter leader, you've probably never heard of Amash before, and he definitely broke rank with Republicans and has angered them and even been threatened with expulsion from the Freedom Caucus for this move, supporting impeaching the president. Why did Justin Amash, you think, actually make this move? Is this a political consideration for him or pretty sincere from his libertarian perspective?
I would honestly, I'd like to think that it's sincere. I mean, we commonly see or regularly see Amash as being a bit more principled, which makes him kind of a target of attack for the president. And he had continued, in the 2 weeks or so leading up to this kind of outcry this week, he was saying he wanted to thoroughly read the Mueller report, wanted to do his due diligence, rather than the rest of the Republicans that I guess now we're a month post Mueller report that they want to forget about it. But Justin Amash kind of wanted to give it its due diligence, and honestly, I respect that, and I respect the thorough nature in which he did it. However, I think, like Alex was saying earlier, that it's kind of silly in the way that if they're going to claim this as bipartisan support, I mean, it's obvious from the recent response by the Freedom Caucus that it's not actually bipartisan at all. They're ready to kick him out. So I think it's principled, and I like the due diligence, but at the same time, I'm not sure where it's going to get him.
Yeah, I think I would mostly agree with that. I haven't actually read the Mueller report, and I think a lot of people who say they have probably haven't either. But I have read several summaries of it, and what it seems like is basically what I thought before, which was, Trump has done a lot of really, really bad things that aren't Russian collusion necessarily. So I think Amash seems to be, basing it off of that, and I think that seems to make sense to me. But I think that the reaction to Amash doing this is an indicator that, at least for the foreseeable future, we will not see many Republicans breaking rank to support impeachment. But it is kind of amusing to see people trying to say that Amash is not conservative enough, because he is one of the most conservative members of the House. But again, today that doesn't matter. You saw that with Mark Sanford, who was, a very, very conservative congressman from South Carolina, but he got primaried for being too anti-Trump. So I don't see a lot of Republicans, or at least Republicans with things to lose. Amash is kind of a different in that way, because Jeff Flake and Bob Corker became sort of staunchly anti-Trump either soon before or soon after announcing that they were not running for re-election. So I cannot imagine, kudos to Amash, but I can't imagine that many people will follow suit.
Yeah, it's a pretty stunning move to see the Freedom Caucus go so far as to offer this condemnation of Amash. And then one of the co-founders of the Tea Party movement, or the Tea Party sort of actual organization, has called on the Freedom Caucus to remove Justin Amash from its ranks for no longer reflecting its values, which I guess means that its values are political domination and not the principles that actually started the entire thing. All right, so moving on to the trade war with China. It is only going to get worse. We're locked into this trade dispute with China. Tariffs are ramping up, and President Trump seems to be quite comfortable in his aggressive posture against China up into the 2020 election. He's probably just going to let this actually be a re-election issue for him, which I find to be surprising. President Xi is also in a position of not benefiting from giving concessions. Neither one of them have a real incentive to move on this. I want to touch on the merits of the trade war's origin. But before we do that, Alex, is there a way out of this situation before American consumers and farmers start to feel the pain even more than they already are?
I mean, like you said, it doesn't seem like either Trump or Xi has many incentives to do that. But I mean, it's a war. You can call a ceasefire, but I can't imagine that happening at this point. I think that it would have been nice to have some kind of trans-Pacific partnership of a kind with other countries in Asia that would have provided the United States a lot more leverage while negotiating with China. Because if we had stronger trade relations with our other trading partners in the region. But I mean, Trump can always call it off, but it doesn't seem like he will.
I'm honestly worried on that aspect about calling it off. I think it's too far gone at this point, right? So Trump rallied mainly in like the Midwest about how we were going to be the whole America first mentality. We're going to bring back jobs, all of that stuff. Not that these tariffs are accomplishing that, because they're not. But I think he is going to ride, like you said, Stephen, he's going to ride this into the 2020 election and keep pushing that American first, make America great mentality. When, I mean, I'm inclined to say that most Americans now believe that the rhetoric that Trump is pushing, that only China is paying for these tariffs, is incorrect, right? And I don't think it's that type of rhetoric is going to have the same impact in 2020 like he thinks it will. Because I mean, we have to remember that the hardest hit farmers for these tariffs are the like in deep red Trump country, so like Iowa, and I don't think it's going to feel the same, or it's going to resonate. The message is going to resonate the same if we're going to go through with these 25% tariffs on all imports.
I sometimes wonder if the Trump base, even the people most affected by these tariffs and the trade dispute, being farmers, people in middle America, but it seems that when Fox News goes out and they start talking to Trump voters in the mainland, they get a sense that people still support this trade war with China and sticking it to them really on the basis of some sort of like form of nationalism. Like even their economic interests get put below the idea of the American flag against the Chinese flag, and that we are trying to levy concessions from them and stop cheating in the economic system, and that they're willing to be hurt directly for that goal. Does that seem right to either of you?
Well, absolutely. It's a brainwashing.
Alex?
Yeah, I mean, I would say on the sort of trade war front, sort of my assumption would be, speaking from like an economic perspective, that tariffs are a good example of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs, where you'd have, theoretically, what I would assume would happen is that a bunch of, say, steel workers would like big steel tariffs because that should help, steel jobs, but everybody who uses steel, which is way more people, all have to pay higher prices for steel, which is bad and on net like much worse. For example, like this was a big deal in the George W. Bush administration put tariffs on steel, and it saved 170,000 jobs in the steel industry, but it costs way more than that, like many more jobs than that in other industries that use steel. So my assumption would be that a bunch of people, tariffs would lead to a bunch of industries being a handful of industry workers being very, very happy about, and then a bunch of other people being like marginally impacted, but not really sort of acting on it because it's like relatively small, even though it's a lot of people who are feeling that sort of hurt. But I think you're right with the sort of politics triumphing over economic interests point, because I think there are a lot of people who do seem to still be behind Trump, but I don't know how those interviews are selected, so that might not be a statistically representative sample. But
yeah, there's certainly an editorial choice behind every news network's choice of who they talk to about the issue. So, Natalie, I read this morning that Ian Bremmer of the Eurasia Group, I think correctly noted that with or without a trade war, relations with China are trending toward conflict. We have sort of a new clashing of superpowers realization on our hands. And it seems to me that perhaps some of the market liberal attitudes about simply trading and having economic ties are not turning are turning out to be wrong when it comes to China and maintaining peace. There's this sort of old anecdote like about two countries have a McDonald's will never go to war. Do you think that this is enough to keep us out of serious conflict with China just because we're business partners?
Yeah, so I think a sort of broad point, I think that the idea that like being trading partners can help sort of diffuse conflict, I think is true. I think where the sort of market liberal or the sort of Friedmanite, Milton Friedmanite had a quote that I'm paraphrasing as something along the lines of economic freedom begets political freedom. I think this is a big point from Capitalism and Freedom, where basically if you give people economic freedom and increase sort of prosperity and growth, people will start demanding political freedoms as well. And I think this has played out in a lot of places historically, but it really hasn't in China.
There was a moment of hope for that, and it got snuffed out.
Yeah. So I think that is sort of, and I mean, I think that is where there are reasons to like China, putting the Uyghurs in concentration camps of a kind, labor camps, and there's sort of myriad of problems and disrespect for individual rights and human rights. I think that like there are a lot of reasons to not like what China's doing, but I do think that it is the sort of business partner where our economies cannot, like it would not make sense for the U.S. to declare war on them. Yeah, I think that the trading partner aspect definitely helps sort of reduce that. But I think I would be interested in seeing like what the U.S. can do to exert pressure on China, because I think their government is deeply has a lot of deep problems, but I'm not sure what those avenues are.
And this kind of goes to either of you, and to Alex's last point. The relationship with China is rife with abuse and dishonesty. Kind of backing up to the origins of this conflict, there have been a lot of people from both sides of the political spectrum who have said that Trump is right in a sense to be reevaluating our relationship with China, but that this might be the wrong tack. Do we need to have a broader discussion in maybe the 2020 election about what our relationship to China is and what we're really getting out of it?
Well, I think when you're maintaining, whether it's a trade partnership or it's an ally, I think maintaining relationships, they need to be evaluated consistently. And I think part of the problem is we hadn't been evaluating our relationship with a lot of countries. I mean, how many countries have we been allies or had trade that we shouldn't have? And I think, Steve and I agree that there is an evaluation process that needs to go on. And honestly, if Trump thinks that after his evaluation, this is the way to treat a partner, I mean, I don't agree with the mechanism in which he's treating them, but I do think it's valid to evaluate them and hold them accountable. We don't want to be partners forever with people that we're not getting anything from that partnership from.
I mean, I guess that's why I would say that the Trans-Pacific Partnership, moving away from it, was such a mistake, is that would be sort of being able to exert pressure on China by building stronger trade relations with other countries. And I think that sort of another approach that you could think about is, if we're going to sort of be in conflict with China, that there's a pretty strong argument that, I think that we should increase sort of very high skilled immigration, because I think then we would be able to attract some people from countries, including China, that are very sort of, highly skilled and will be able to innovate in technology and whatever. And I think it would be better if they did that here than over in China under the Chinese Communist Party. So I think there are some approaches to try to sort of improve our ability to put pressure on China, but this is not sort of my area of expertise. So,
and I honestly think, this is a question for both of you. Honestly, do you think that the American electorate, generally speaking, actually cares, like, as their number one priority is our relationship with China?
No, I do not. I think that Americans' priority for a long time has been the benefits of that relationship without actually linking that much to the political connection to China. I think Americans have been Walmartified. This might put me in like the camp of a Tucker Carlson who's sort of concerned about materialism in general and like the worship of cheap things. But I think that we are in a marriage with that aspect of it, but people don't think about that as being sort of a China thing.
Yeah, I think it would be something along the lines of like people would tell you that they want to be tough on China. If you ask them like, should we be tough on China or should we be easy on China? I think they would say, yes, tough on China.
Tough, America, tough.
But like would also be like, but I also don't want to give up like low cost consumer goods. And so I think that's kind of, I mean, and like trade polls really well. Free trade polls very well among Democrats and Republicans still, even. And I think a sort of vast majority of the population approves of free trade. So I think this sort of, I mean, on the whole, I think you're right that like this is an important issue for few people. But I think political doublespeak of we're going to be very tough on China, but also we're going to keep letting their like we also want cheap consumer goods to come in to lower the cost of living or avoid raising the cost of living. I think is basically what most politicians effectively say / do, and I think that works pretty well for them.
Yeah, I think you might get more support for being tougher on China and even having to raise some of the prices of consumer goods in your average Walmart on talking about the humanitarian issues that are afoot over there, particularly with the Uyghurs, and then just their general population and what they're subjected to, as opposed to the theft of intellectual property from Silicon Valley individuals who are already millionaires. I don't think that there's a lot of political support in the grassroots for, oh gosh, we got to protect the inventors out in San Francisco. I think you could maybe get more to that with the humanitarian angle. So on that note, abortion laws passed in Georgia. Does it matter when Hollywood and companies boycott? So we just had 2 film projects pull out of the state of Georgia after the governor signed the so-called heartbeat bill, which bans abortions after a fetal heartbeat can be detected. And what we had was the Lionsgate comedy Barb and Star Go to Vista Del Mar, starring Kristen Wiig and Annie Mamolo, and director Reed Monroe's Amazon series The Power were all set to be shot in Georgia. You also have this with shows like The Walking Dead, which somehow are miraculously still continuing. This is an increasingly common tactic for the political left to employ against red states who implement conservative laws. I am always in favor of letting the market speak when laws and regulations are bad, and these might be examples of where they are bad and they go too far. And this is, in a way, a market reaction to something when, companies and production studios decide that they don't want to do business in Georgia. But I also kind of dislike that we can't just all live together in the U.S. and have differences state to state without micro-targeted boycotts like this. You don't see Chick-fil-A leaving New York after their totally hands-off approach to abortion or anything of the sort. So to either of you to just kind of dive into this question of Hollywood and leaving Georgia over abortion laws, what do you think about this and the choice by studios to pull out in that way and sort of snub the state of Georgia?
This issue is obviously contentious, and I think I'm kind of with Stephen. Like I like that the market is signaling this and that people are bringing out their opinion and acting on it. But at the same time, this is a $9.5 billion industry in Georgia just in 2018. That's going to affect a lot more people than the people that created this law, right? So in my head, I'm thinking a boycott of this nature punishes the wrong people, right? And I'm not talking about the millionaire movie makers or producers. I'm talking about the people that benefit from this entertainment industry in the area. So like that's going to be like your second story characters, or like maybe even film crews that specifically moved to this area for this business. And in my opinion, they had not a lot of influence over the law that happened. However, I also do like Steven said, I do like that it's a market signal and it's saying, and people are acting on like what they believe in. I just think, yeah.
Yeah, so I would say that as far as, I mean, Hollywood is sort of an interesting example because one of the reasons why Hollywood, like, there are so many movie productions in Georgia is because Georgia has a super, super generous film tax credit program. And they shell out a lot of money for, in effectively tax subsidies to film production companies to move there. So generally speaking, film tax credits are very ineffective as a tool to generate economic growth. They create some jobs, but the jobs tend to last an average of, according to one report from Michigan, 23 days. And they maybe create, state might spend, $100 million, and they'd probably only get back about 14 million to 20 million in tax revenue. There's a lot of my instinct, maybe Georgia might be somewhat different because I think they've built up like a sort of institutional they've built up sort of an institutional or like film production. There are film production companies that have like started to headquarter there and
infrastructure.
Yes, that's the word I'm looking for. Infrastructure. Maybe they have some like film production infrastructure that they'd be like that if Hollywood leaves, that would be sort of dead. But I think
empty studio lots and just sort of decaying buildings of where they used to have a film business.
Yeah, I think that would be the main concern. But I think generally, film tax credit programs are bad and pretty inefficient and a bad deal for state taxpayers. So, but politicians like them because they can say, "Hey, look, we're using our policies. We got all these famous people that come here and shoot movies. Like, look at us."
And I just can't imagine conservative voters who would have favored the abortion law being passed in the first place. I can't imagine them being bummed out because The Walking Dead will no longer be shooting in the woods outside Atlanta. Like, I feel like this sort of just misses that people have values, and sometimes they put their values and their emotions far over things like economic benefit. And I agree that there is, an influx of business and it comes into states, but it really is that short-term impact. Like Alex mentioned, where, actors are going to come into an area, tons of studio workers, and then they're going to go out to restaurants in the area and they're going to kind of bring business. But if that restaurant owner is pro-life, I would be willing to bet that they care a lot more about the abortion issue than they do a little influx of movie workers who they personally and privately kind of dislike.
Yeah. I think that the sort of economics of the program, like and most programs I think have a cap, but effectively you end up, I think Massachusetts is the one I'm most familiar with. They subsidize, I think, 25% of actors' salaries up to $1 million. Which is pretty nuts, I think. So to me, if this leads to more states getting rid of their film tax credit programs, then
yeah, it's funny. Go ahead, Natalie.
I also think that it's interesting because you have some just pulling out full stop, and then we have the other people that like the other Hollywood, whether they're socialites or producers that like are putting in their say, but not pulling out entirely. Right. So like you had, I think it was, I'm blanking on the name of the show, but they had already agreed to film in Georgia. And they said like, oh, like the profit or some margin of money that they're going to make off the 3 episodes they film in Georgia, they're going to donate rather than like leaving Georgia completely. So they say they have this certain stance, but they're not necessarily acting on it, which I think is also an interesting component.
It's funny to see, presumably liberal, kind of filmmakers and companies, right, leave California because of the economic pressure to leave, and then they can't be in the South either because of moral objection. Where are they going to go? Where can you, be in a place that is economically liberal in a good sense, and also culturally, I don't see a place where we can continue to do this, where we just sort of march out of areas on moral indignation grounds when sort of the economic benefit is sort of what you should be aiming for in a business model. But then again, morals and emotions do matter.
Yeah. I guess one question for you, Stephen, because you live in North Carolina, right?
Mm-hmm. We got Wilmington, that hub out there for film.
Was there any? Did you? What was because I remember with the bathroom bill issue in 2016, I think there were a lot of sort of companies that said they were leaving, or people who said like was some college basketball.
Yeah. So, Alex, I'm really glad that you brought that up because that's a fantastic example. And I think it is one where, I don't know, I have a better feeling about how it went down and why it went down. So, the transgender bathroom law in North Carolina was, I think, very silly and unnecessarily oppressive, trying to fix a problem that does not really exist by mandating that biological men and women use their assigned restrooms. Even in most cases, when you have a transgender person, they're not even noticeable, and they're going to use the one in which they identify. And really, nobody is disturbed or upset by this in practice. But it became a very emotional issue when there was actually a law passed to govern people's behavior for bathroom assignment. And what you had was the NCAA sort of leading the charge for the basketball tournament, say that they were not going to have the tournament games in North Carolina, which was a big, big deal. That is sort of the crown jewel for North Carolina of what we're going to have here. And then there was also the ACC basketball tournament. There was a lot of pressure for these places to pull out and play these final games in other states. And you even had some teams say that they just weren't going to go to North Carolina. And you also had Bruce Springsteen cancel a concert in North Carolina. And here's where I think you kind of draw the lines between what works and what doesn't. North Carolina is very emotionally attached as a state and financially to filling up its sports stadiums. Its sports teams matter a great deal. And for developers and for politicians who live in these districts, that really matters. What does not matter, I think, is when musicians would pull out and cancel their shows. What that does is create animosity between the people of North Carolina, fans of a musician, and the actual artists themselves, who then say, like, I won't come to North Carolina because, there are a bunch of hillbillies there and I won't play for them. And you had that at a small level too, or small touring bands, like really small ones, like who would fill up maybe small clubs, would say that they're going to cancel their appearance in North Carolina over the trans bathroom law. And their fan base is widely liberal, progressive. They're punk rock fans. They're trans kids who are going to be in the audience for these shows. And they're going to say, I'm not coming to North Carolina because your state's messed up. And you also are a vulnerable person. And I'm just going to leave you, right? I'm just going to leave you alone in North Carolina. And that never made any sense to me, where you would have activist bands abandon their fan base who want them to come and shine a light on the issue. And that was kind of where I got off the train, right? Like, I thought that was where it was personally damaging to people.
That's good. Yeah, that's pretty pretty good case. Yeah,
that's my rant. So, yeah, I think the activism thing can work if it's targeted, but I also, and maybe this connects back to the issue of trade. I think people a lot of times put their emotions and their feelings on an issue above what might actually be good for them economically, whether that be the film incentives issue or whether that be trade with China. People want what they want, and sometimes they don't know exactly why they might want it. All right, so that brings us to our final segment. Last thing that we're just going to talk about is whatever you want to talk about in a segment yet to be named, where you get to bring up sort of an underreported issue of the day, something that's really just sort of got your attention that you would like to tell the audience about. Natalie, let's start with you. What's been on your mind?
So in terms of like an underreported issue of the day, I was thinking, this is what I wrote my most recent piece on, and I'm kind of regretting that I didn't bring it up. Why does no one care anymore about the sentiment around why we call Uncle Joe Uncle Joe? Why does that not bother anyone in terms of Joe Biden?
If they're asking a question, I don't know.
So we were talking about it at work recently, and we're like, why does that not creep anyone out that we refer to like a politician as an uncle, or like Uncle Joe, or like we call like other politicians, we use like rhetoric, like calling them family members. Why does that not seem to bother anyone? And why is it stuck?
I think the onion is the reason, right? I think our internet culture has melded the meme of Joe Biden with the real Joe Biden. People really think that he might actually be at home, and think of him as that he might be at home, like washing his Trans Am in the driveway with no shirt on, because that's what Uncle Joe Biden would do. And I think we've just sort of adapted how we think about him in that way.
I just think, like, because I was talking about it with my other colleagues at work, and like there's like a creepiness nature to calling politicians members of your family, but I could see the onion being the one who originally inspired it.
I think so. Alex, what about you? What's been on your mind?
Yeah, I think it's kind of an interesting thing that has been sort of undercovered is the details of a financial transactions tax. People sort of like, there's sort of a concept when people talk about tax policy economics that people want low rates and broad bases. But an important thing to remember is that sometimes you can have a tax that's promised to have a very, very low rate, but to raise a lot of revenue. And usually what that means is that they're taxing the same thing over and over again. And I think that's sort of an example of that is some states have gross receipts taxes, which is taxing sort of the entire value of a transaction at every point in the production process. And those are sort of bad economically because they sort of disproportionately impact places that have a lot of different stages of production, sort of with longer supply chains. And so I think a financial transactions tax is like a pretty hot idea in Democratic primary politics. I think a lot of candidates are going to support them, and promise sort of a very low rate, but a lot of revenue. And I think that there are a lot of problems with that, taxing sort of different transactions that tend to happen more frequently, a lot more, and having a lot of negative economic effects.
I am not a fan of being double taxed. Alex Muresianu and Natalie Dowzicky, thank you so much for joining us today on Underscored. That brings us to the end of this episode. This has been the Underscored podcast brought to you by Young Voices. You can find out more about what we do at www.young-voices.com and follow us on Twitter at YVADV. I will also put links to where you can follow Alex and Natalie both on Twitter as well. We'll be back next week with more of the Underscored podcast. Until then, stay free.